This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. It's good to have you back. We're going to continue our conversation that's growing out of John's book, Endangered Gospel. You guys are looking and smiling. You're making me uncomfortable. What's going on behind me?
Nothing wrong.
I was going to say thanks for having me back, Ron. It's been a real pleasure.
Did I mess up the intro?
No, it's weird. Keep going.
Do you want me to push? Want me to hit stop and
let's
go back?
Keep going.
All right. We'll keep going. So we're continuing our conversation from John's book, Endangered Gospel. Previously, we talked about the opening of Genesis, the creation account, and this good world that God created. This is foundational for our understanding of God's plan and His desire to create a better place, and how that looks for us as Christians, how it informs our understanding. So we want to move that conversation forward now, getting into the account of the fall and its consequences. We're going to look at that and see what it really says, and to a degree, see what it doesn't say. Yeah, I'm off to a great start today. And maybe offer a little bit of a corrective to some of the things that maybe we have thought for a long time as Christians. So Sam's going to start us off by summarizing the account of the fall and get us going from there.
Sure. So we thought we'd work through the story quickly in chapter 3, Genesis chapter 3, highlighting a few things, but then concluding with the actual reading of the curses near the end. We call this section Creation's Collapse. Is that correct, John?
Sure. Perfect.
Okay. So it begins with, all of a sudden, the serpent comes out of nowhere, and apparently he's very crafty and unlike other wild animals that Yahweh had created. And just as a reminder, chapter 2 ends, and things seem to be pretty good. There's a man and a woman, and creation has been seemingly named, and everything's wonderful. They're still needing to produce and be fruitful, multiply. They haven't actually done what they're supposed to do yet, but it's starting out pretty well.
Looks like everything's off to a good start, right?
Then the serpent comes out of nowhere. And if you recall, we've had discussions about serpent, which we'll probably allude to here and there as we go along. But there's a whole podcast, I think, Christian Urban Myths Part 2.
Right.
You're welcome to listen to that if you have not.
Maybe we should remind them, who is the serpent and who is the serpent not?
Well, we suggest that the serpent is not Satan.
That's what that was our conclusion, our assertion.
That is just an animal in the kingdom that has been created.
Yeah.
That just happens to be particularly crafty. And so this animal comes along and starts interacting with the man and the woman, talking to them, which we find interesting. Which, I'm sorry, like people get stuck on a lot of things,
right?
But I rarely hear people get worried about, the serpent talking. Like it's actually talking to them.
And this is not surprising to Eve.
Right. She doesn't I didn't expect this. It's not like the talking donkey.
So should we read into this that back in the original design, humans and animals interacted, they talked, there were these great, it's like Narnia. Is that what we're seeing there? Should we go there in our exegesis?
Perhaps.
I'm going no, but if John wants to go, perhaps he can. Although maybe it's like Radagast the Brown, who's able to interact with the animals.
Going Tolkien.
Yeah, dorky.
I love you, man.
Thanks. So regardless of how they're communicating, whether it's with chirps or actual words, there's this communication, and the serpent says, "Did God say you should not eat any tree?" And they go back and forth about what God said or didn't say. With the woman, she actually adds to it a little bit and says,
"I have a new theory."
Oh, look at him
Wait,
in here.
Before I can even finish,
the confusion of languages at Babel is when humans and animals stop being able to speak to one another.
Oh, wow!
Next commentary.
That is new. I have never heard anything like that.
You know why? Anyway, okay, that's possible. We'll put that on
perhaps
the back burner. Perhaps, sure.
We'll put a pin in that one.
Oy vey. So the woman, why am I being the adult in the room? What has happened in
I
this
know, right?
situation? This is why I don't lead out, John. All right. So the woman says, no, he said, we're not actually supposed to touch it, which is not actually what God said, but it seems likely you probably shouldn't get near it. The servant says, oh, you won't die. God knows you'll be like him, knowing good and evil, which is not exactly a lie, which people make it out to be. I hear when I was preached and taught about, they say, oh, the serpent was lying from the beginning. Well, not exactly. what he's saying seems to be actually right on.
Right, because God, after the fall, says in verse 22, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So God confirms what the serpent originally said would happen.
Right.
And can I ask a question here?
No.
Just
I'm sure.
oh, Sam. When he says good and evil, you will know good from good and evil. Should we understand that in a moral, ethical sense? Like you're going to know the difference between, what murder is or isn't. I think often we hear good and evil and we think of it in a moral, ethical sense. My understanding has always been that it goes beyond those questions, includes those, but goes beyond it, to broader sense of you're going to know right from wrong. You're going to be able to organize yourself as a society in the most effective way. You're going to know right from wrong and making good or wise decisions on, again, how to organize yourself socially, how to use the resources of the world. I mean, does it include those kinds of broad right and wrong decisions, or is it strictly moral and ethical, at least how those words are traditionally defined?
Did we talk about this last week? I thought maybe
To some
we did.
extent, briefly, just the nature of...
Did I fall asleep during that part of the
Likely.
Memory's the first thing to go.
When you're 50, that happens.
It
51.
does happen, yeah.
We talked briefly, I think, about the nature of being exposed to things before you're ready. There's an intellectual and a moral capacity that are not quite lined up. And I don't know, do you think it'd be wrong to frame it as kind of like an innocence loss type situation? Like there's an understanding of like if you're here, you're fine, but as soon as you get exposed to this, you can't unsee it. You can't unknow it. And that sort of thing. Like now there's this knowledge of these other things out there where blissful ignorance, we might say.
Yeah, and then you have knowledge, knowledge of good and evil and knowledge of good and evil. Like you can know you shouldn't do this. If you do this, bad things will happen. Or you can know it because someone tells you and they've kind of given you parameters and they've told you, or you can have intimate knowledge of that.
Right.
You know the negative consequences of these behaviors because you've done it.
Yeah.
You drank too much and now you're drunk and now you know that drinking too much gives you a headache the next morning. Or you can be told by someone who's drunk before or knows the science behind it that if you do this, you will have a headache in the morning. There are two ways of having knowledge of the consequences. And so the knowledge here, maybe there's a certain kind of knowledge that God wants them to have and another kind of knowledge he'd rather they not have, perhaps for their own good.
Right. Or as we said, and I now remember us talking about this last time, that knowledge that they would have had eventually, but they're trying to jump the gun. I mean, as parents, I think we've all seen that with our kids, that they want to move on to things they're not ready for, they're not mature enough to handle it. And our Adam and Eve just trying to jump the gun on getting knowledge that they might have gotten organically had they allowed themselves to grow in God's timing. Yeah. Interesting question.
Speaking of moving on.
Happy to.
Oh, nice.
So the woman is kind of, I guess, convinced by the serpent that perhaps there's something to this tree. She sees that it's good for food, pleasing to the eye, and it's going to make her wise. Again, what does that mean? Perhaps having certain things she didn't have, a certain knowledge or experience she did not have. So she took of the fruit and ate it and gave some to her husband. Now, let me take a pause and say a lot of people blame Eve out from the outset, saying, how dare she? What was she doing? Like it's her fault that all this has happened to the world.
Yeah.
And yet the text says then she takes it and immediately gives it to her husband Adam. The implication is he's standing right next to her.
Yeah.
Her husband who is with her.
Right.
Exactly.
Like not off in the hut somewhere or wherever they're living in Eden.
Working in the garden.
The palace, the chalet. But right there next to her. And so at no point does he say, honey, I think maybe we shouldn't do this.
Right.
So before we castigate Eve too much, I think Adam is as easily as culpable.
And certainly I think we've all heard the argument that the serpent went to Eve because he saw her as the more gullible part of the couple, that somehow we can castigate women in general because Eve was the one who was tempted first. And that says something about the nature of women, which I think the text does not support. I think that's putting a lot of interpretive freight on that text. I don't think I would go there.
The serpent could just as easily be going to Eve because he perceived her to be the one who wore the pants in the family.
Yeah. That she's
Goes
the
straight
decision.
to the top.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to go down those roads, it's just as easy to make that argument.
Speculation can go all sorts of ways.
Yes,
Correct. And speaking of pants, immediately after eating the fruit, They have their eyes opened. They realize, oh, we don't have any pants
We're
on.
not wearing any pants.
Definitely no physical pants, perhaps metaphorical.
Yeah, nailing the transition.
And they sewed fig leaves together to make loincloths for themselves. And this goes back to what we were saying. Like before, as I say, blissful ignorance.
Yeah.
They were nude, and that seemed to be no problem.
Right.
But now all of a sudden, there's a shame associated with nudity that was not there.
Yeah.
So what's this knowledge that they have?
Right.
And that goes to speaking, about this gradual progression of understanding.
So over time, we would have started wearing clothes, but at that time, we don't.
Sure.
Yeah. Oh,
I know.
Maybe.
Although it does kind of, it makes me think of us talking about how, kids, I know watching little kids, they are shameless in their nudity.
Correct. They don't care.
Yeah, and it's only as we get older that we decide we have to wear clothes. Am I drawing a parallel where none exists? Or?
Well, as they are fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, they're eventually going to end up in Michigan, where they will want pants regardless.
Correct.
Yeah, we're talking about the fall, in the middle of fall in Michigan. It's cloudy, it's raining, it's cold.
So that's the start of the story. That sets things into motion that are going to get worse for them. Before we move too far forward, the fruit, there's been a lot of speculation about what it was, and we will not because it's fruitless.
Oh, man.
So
The text does not say what kind of fruit it is.
now, so in verse 8, they hear the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. I don't know what the evening breeze was, but apparently at evening, a nice breeze kicks up.
Literally in the wind of the day.
Yes, the wind of the day.
Ruach. Ruach.
So they hear God walking in with his anthropomorphic legs, and they hide themselves from God's presence. So here we get our first understanding and a bringing in of, I think, God's holiness in the text. It doesn't mention it specifically, but as we progress through the rest of the Old Testament, the ideas of God being holy and God's presence not being something you want to enter into because we're a sinful people.
Right.
And so I don't know how far we want to push that, but they feel like God is coming and they don't want to be caught in that, whether it's shame or worry of God's holiness, what have you. I think depending upon the writer. So God...
I was just going to say, at the very least, it demonstrates that sin compromises what was once a comfortable relationship. Human beings weren't afraid of God. Before sin, had God come, walking through the garden in the breeze of the day, there would have been no shame, there would have been no fear. Perhaps a sense of awe, respect due to God, but had this event occurred without eating the fruit, they wouldn't have felt the need to hide themselves. And so we're already seeing the beginning of that effect. The relationship with God is compromised.
Speculative.
Come on. Is it really?
We have no statement of how they would have responded to him being in their presence prior to their sinning. So they could be hiding from God's presence because of their shame, which is obviously happening in this case. But that doesn't mean had he shown up in the garden before, they would have been like, oh, Daddy's home, and climbed up on his lap. There still may have been this awesome presence thing that Sam is talking about.
Right.
May still have been there without the shame, but still a reverent distance.
Yeah, and I think I said something to the effect of that as I was pontificating there.
Okay.
No, there would have been that sense of awe, of respect towards God. I'm not saying that I'm not suggesting they're going to climb up in his lap, that they're going to sit down and play cards or something like that. I'm just saying that we already see the consequences of their sin, that this desire to hide themselves from God is indicative of a change to their relationship. That's all I'm saying.
Fair enough.
Full disclosure here, John hates when people talk about the garden as being euchre with God. So if you hadn't caught on to that.
Yeah, and I agree with that. The text does not say that. So hopefully I've made it clear that's not where I was going.
So here we have the first game of Marco Polo. God says, "Where are you, Marco?" And the man says, "Polo, I'm right here. We were hiding." He found him. And he said, and the reason he gives is, I was afraid because I was naked and hid myself. And of course, God responds, who told you that? Yeah. And he makes the conclusion, have you eaten from the tree? And of course, the man immediately diverts the question, this woman that you gave me. She gave me the fruit from the tree. Classic deflection. Classic not taking responsibility. It's not just millennials. It was Adam as well. Sorry. Then God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" And what does the woman do? The same thing.
Yeah,
it wasn't me. It was this serpent that you created. She didn't say that you created, but I think it might be implied. Tricked me, and I ate it.
Yeah. It's not my fault.
And so this all comes to a head at this point. What is God going to do? God creates this world, creates this good world, has an idea for how it can flourish and be good, and seemingly immediately the humans defy God and partake of this fruit. And do we want to talk about the symbolism of each of these characters before we get into the curses?
I think maybe we'll list each one of the curses at a time and kind of unpack them.
Okay,
and
very good.
We can do that in that, and then after we exhaust the one, we'll go on to the second one.
Okay. So here are what we call the curses, starting in verse 14 of chapter 3. Do you want me to read it?
No, you've done enough.
Thank goodness.
I should say something, so I'll start reading.
Something serious, not just wisecracks.
So God turns to the serpent and says, knows it to the serpent, not to the devil, not to Satan,
Right.
not to the prince of darkness. He turns to the wisest of the animals in the garden and says, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel."
You just in reading and nod at us like I'm
That's it. That's what I got.
Oh, okay.
kidding.
So now it's up to us from here on.
Now it's up to you.
Well, to reiterate what you said, it's clearly talking about a creature, one of God's creation, the serpent, not the devil. And I think it's interesting that apparently it used to have legs, some sort of Komodo dragon situation.
Sweet. Or at least some kind of a dragon. We're back to Tolkien now here.
Right, right. So yes, we have the first curse against specifically this serpent. And I mean, we could make a lot of observations about that. The serpent apparently has free will to do things and is going to be held accountable for this,
Right.
even though that's not been said yet. That he has made choices that have consequences, and he will have to reap these consequences.
Is this a good point to ask the question? I mean, what does the serpent represent? Is the serpent just a serpent? Is that his only role in narrative, or does he represent something more? Should we read more into it in terms of creation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of speculations of how the serpent comes to know what the serpent knows. Mm-hmm. To know that if you eat from this tree, you will gain knowledge, godlike knowledge that God is apparently holding back from you. And people have long asked, well, how would the serpent know this? And this is key to the argument that the serpent somehow is the devil, and that's why he has this advanced knowledge. But there are other options, there are other possibilities. And that raises at least one possibility, that the serpent knows that this tree will give you knowledge of good and evil, because perhaps the serpent has partaken of this tree, eaten of the tree himself, and learned certain things that elevated his knowledge. Perhaps this tree was the source of the serpent's superior knowledge or wisdom or craftiness among all the other creatures. And so if that were the case, the serpent could be asking an honest question of the woman. Did God really say you couldn't? Because he never told me I couldn't.
Yeah.
That might be a legit question. I mean, we were never told that God said to all the animals in the garden, you may not eat of this tree. Mm-hmm. This is only said to the man.
Right.
And if the serpent was never given that command, and the serpent did partake, and the serpent did grow in knowledge, it is quite possible that he's asking a legit question to the woman.
Sure.
Are you sure? I've eaten. Things have worked out pretty good for me. Maybe God's holding something back from you.
Yeah.
To plant the seed of doubt in the mind. And so what you might have is a distinction here between the humankind, which is morally accountable to God, has rules, has dominion and responsibility, and with that responsibility comes limitations. You can't do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Animals, on the other hand, are creatures that seem, from a moral standpoint, not to be accountable to humans in the same way. They have less restrictions on sexual partners. They have less restrictions when it comes to things like stealing. Anyone who's had animals know that they steal and eat whatever they can get their mouths on. And they may be transgressing our wishes, but in the wild, animals eat wherever they want. So this could be a distinction between morally accountable humans and morally non-accountable animals. And the offer to eat the fruit could be an unaccountable animal asking an accountable human to act as one who is not accountable to God.
Very interesting. I'm just trying to think if there's any text that suggests that there's accountability among animals. I mean, I'm kind of thinking about after the flood, the shedding of blood, where even animals are accountable for shedding blood. Am I remembering this correctly? This is when I'm trying to quote a text without.
Yeah, if a human kills a human, then that human's life shall be taken. And if an animal kills a human, well, we're going to kill that animal too. This may be a way of holding up the sanctity of human life. If a person takes the life of another person, we're going to take that. If an animal takes the life, we're going to take that animal's life, because that animal has become a threat to humans. And human lives, being made in God's image, are valuable enough that even animals are going to pay a price. Did God ever give animals a command not to eat humans or to attack humans?
Not that I can read.
Right.
Not explicitly.
So there are consequences for animal misbehavior, but is that the same thing as moral accountability?
Right.
Is that just a way of saving humans and protecting humans from animals?
Yeah.
So that animals will not go on and find other humans to bite.
Yeah, and let's not forget that when animals eat fermented berries, bad things also happen. That could also have been the fruit. No, probably not.
Did you see that YouTube video?
I've seen
with the squirrel.
Drunk animals are the best, apparently.
I've seen the elephant one where the elephants eat the fermented berries.
That seems like a lot of berries to get an elephant drunk.
Yeah.
This is far afield from our topic.
We're really getting off track here.
But I think what we see is the function of the serpent in the story is that of accomplice to the crime.
Yeah. The humans are the ones given the restrictions, and the serpent, at a bare minimum, is instrumental in tempting the humans to step into a role of an animal-like status of lack of accountability to God's rules. And whether there was a motive or not, like if the serpent realizes that is trying to elevate its own status by bringing humans down to an animal-like level of non-accountability, there could be some nefarious motive there, because being the wisest of the animals, the serpent could detect a status differential between humans and animals that the serpent could be envious of. And this could be a ploy to lower the humans, which would raise the status of the wisest of the animals. So this could be a power play on the part of the serpent.
And that would kind of explain the consequence then, the curse upon the serpent then. You made this power play of trying to elevate yourself, so now you're going to get the exact opposite of what you were looking for. You are going to be demoted to the lowest of all animals, crawling on your belly and eating dust.
So the punishment fits the crime.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think now would be a good time to say that through each of these, we're going to notice there are two different sections. There's the curse that comes from God, and there are consequences that also result that are not necessarily God specifically ordained. They're just the nature of what happens, right? So here we have the curse is you're not going to have legs anymore.
Right.
You're going to crawl around on your belly. Or maybe it used to have wings. We never know.
Yeah, if it's a dragon.
It's possible. But the consequence is now there's this enmity between the woman and the offspring. That there's going to be this relationship that is not good.
Yeah.
Whatever that's going to look like. And that's not God saying, I'm going to make it this way. That's just the nature of it. I guess as humanity, we look at the serpent and say, fool me once, right? But not anymore. Like, no, we're not going to, as George Bush says, fool me twice, won't get fooled again. That's a direct quote.
I was thinking the Who won't be fooled again.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So, again, we see the humanity looks at that and said, no, we're going to be leery of this creature from now on. And that's not God saying you will be leery of it. That's just the way it works out.
Yeah.
Yeah, so from this point forward, there is enmity between humans and the animal kingdom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that enmity, this isn't just about snakes and humans, although I think the language here directly applies to snakes and humans, right? I mean, how do snakes attack humans? They bite the heel.
Yeah.
And how do humans respond and subdue snakes? They crush the head. So there's going to be this perpetual tension between snakes and humans. And I think this is representative of the wider tension between humans and the animal kingdom going forward.
Yeah.
If we were talking about sharks, they don't necessarily bite the heel. They might take a chunk out of your side, and humans turn around and harpoon them, or hook them or something, right? Shoot them. But the same tension between snakes and humans we see play out with snakes. I mean, humans and sharks, humans and tigers, humans and mice, as your family has experienced recently, Ron.
Yes, we have.
There's this disruption of harmony between the two kingdoms.
Yeah, and when I asked a question earlier, that's kind of what I was wondering about. Does the serpent in the story, in terms of his role in the story, does he represent the animal kingdom in general? Is that his function, is to be that representative of the animal kingdom, so that the curse is not just between human beings and snakes, although it's very obvious how that plays out. But should it be broadly understood as now there is disharmony and enmity between human beings and the animal kingdom in general, where previously there had been at least the implication of a fairly harmonious relationship.
Yeah. And I think as we look at the other two sets of consequences, we're going to see that the outcome isn't just limited to the two parties. The kind of consequence brought about by this initial sin is played out over and over again with all kinds of humans and all kinds of other humans and animals and the soil, right? You know, we're going to hear at the end, to the man, you are dust, and to the dust you will return. That also happens to women, although that's not said to the woman.
Right.
That also happens to serpents. They return to dust, although it's not said. So the consequences, some of the consequences are spoken specifically to one of the parties, but they represent a wider set of people who are going to suffer from these consequences. So I think it's a totally valid move to say the tension between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent is not just about snakes and people. It's about humans and the animal kingdom.
Yeah.
Anything more to say about that one, or should we go on to read the next one?
Yeah,
you want to read the next passage, Ron?
Oh, sure.
That's be the consequence between the woman.
Yeah. Sorry, grab my
consequences to the woman.
All right. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you.
Okay, so the curse now seems to be that there will be an increased pain in childbirth. We could talk about that since we're all familiar with childbirth, having never had our own children. We have children, but we didn't give birth to children.
It was not a painful experience for us.
That's not true. It was for me.
Was it really?
So, well, it's an aside. So it was during the birth of my second child, Sophia, and leading up to it, I tripped on some steps and caught myself and broke my pinky.
Okay.
So I'm in there, consoling, encouraging my wife. She grabs my hand, that broken pinky hand, and squeezes. Now, I can't scream because she's in childbirth. I've just got a broken pinky. So I just grin and bear it. So it was painful for me, but not the same pain.
You probably grimaced and bore it.
That's definitely true. There was some grimacing involved. Yeah. But I just want to bring out that the wording is greatly increase.
Interesting.
As opposed to not give pain.
Yeah.
It's going to be worse than it might have been before, is how I read it.
Yeah, it seems to suggest that pain in childbirth is not a result of the curse. That maybe pain or some sort of discomfort at minimum was going to characterize the birthing process. I mean, greatly increased, that seems to be a reasonable inference from the text. Would you say that?
Yeah, I'd want to read it in Hebrew, but sure, the way it comes out in the NRSV seems to indicate that there would have been some kind of lesser pain beforehand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good call. Want to make sure it's an accurate translation.
I do what I can.
Actually, I can give reason to doubt the NRSV a little bit. Today in New Testament exegesis, we were looking at a passage from 1 Timothy where I really disagree with the NRSV translation. So, yeah, we can call them out if we want to.
Rava, multiply, cause become great.
Nice job.
I do what I can.
Thank goodness for these handheld devices where we can look things up instantaneously.
Yeah. So, regardless of all that, that's the actual curse for the woman, that having children is going to cause pain. So this thing that they're supposed to do, be fruitful and multiply, now there's going to be pain involved with it, at least for the woman. And man, if he breaks his finger.
Right. But that's a really interesting point that you make, though, because the fulfillment of the mission, be fruitful and multiply, is now complicated. It now has this curse associated with it. And I don't know that I've ever really, thought about it to that point that, yeah, this good thing that God created for you is now not going to be so great for you.
So some symptoms of this could be the birthing experience itself could be painful. Mm-hmm. The labor process could be painful. Mm-hmm. This could be talking about the complications in childbirth that often lead to death. Mm-hmm. I think in the ancient world, without modern medicine, more often, certainly a lot more often than we see it today, women don't make it through childbirth.
Yeah, exactly. Mortality in childbirth was very, very common. I don't know that we can really estimate. I've heard estimates up to 50%, but that seems a little high to me. But to your point, John, yeah, death in childbirth was a very legitimate possibility.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's not just pain. And part of the pain might be the fear. I mean, on the one hand, we have this almost irresistible urge to procreate. And yet, the smart person would go, man, I'm never going there. At least a smart woman, because she's going to say, I might die. And yet, we do it anyway. And so, not just the pain, but the fear of, man, I hope I get through this okay.
So with the serpent we saw, if the serpent was trying to elevate its status by somehow lowering the humans, by making them morally unaccountable or getting them in trouble with God or whatever, and we see that the serpent being lowered is kind of like a reversal, like the punishment fits the crime. Mm-hmm. In what sense, do you guys see a sense in which punishing the woman with painful childbearing could be a fit punishment for the crime of eating from the forbidden tree?
Wow, you sprung that one on me. Yeah, at the moment I'm drawing a blank. I'm wondering if you've got something in mind, though. There.
Oh, I do.
Okay, well, I think you're just going to have to run with it because I'm not coming up with it.
Give me a second. I've got this new fancy commentary by the Paulus Bible Commentary written by none other than John C. Nugent. Let me see what he says about that.
I'm pretty sure it was in the other book, which you both claimed that you read in preparation for today.
We read it like college students read stuff.
We all know what that kind of reading looks like.
God says to Adam, who should have passed along to Eve, that if you eat from this forbidden tree, on the day that you eat of it, you will die. Mm-hmm. And that's precisely what the serpent called into question.
Yeah.
Will you really die?
Are you sure?
And especially if he's eating from it, and look, he's still slithering around or flying or whatever he's doing on his two legs.
Sure.
He's still alive, so why would she die? Mm-hmm. But she received a word from the Lord saying you would. So she was willing to take life, human life, into her own hands to gain this experience. She didn't value life enough. She's willing to risk death for the sake of having this fruit that looked good to the eye and like it would taste good and make her wise. Right. So perhaps God, in making childbearing difficult, is teaching both husband and wife how to value the gift of life. Mm-hmm. So that it takes 9 months of labor, and you guys are both fathers. You've borne a pregnancy together with your wife to experience how long and arduous that process is, how fragile and vulnerable the birthing process is, and close friends probably of all of us have experienced near-death experiences during childbearing. All of us, I'm sure, know people who have suffered miscarriages. That
been there.
The birthing process has become, for humans, a really something that makes us value the gift of life when it finally happens.
Yeah, it's fraught with peril. And that's a really good point, that it's not just dying in the birthing process, but like you said, miscarriages, modern medicine has greatly reduced those. Stillbirths or children that die shortly after birth. Again, in the ancient world, very, very common. The first year of life was no guarantee. So a lot of kids died in that first year. So, we probably don't appreciate, thanks to modern medicine, just how perilous, how fragile that whole period is.
So
gestation and birth.
So maybe, and it's speculative, again, that God in making the childbirthing process perilous the way it is, has increased the respect that humans have for life. You didn't take it seriously enough. Well, after you spend 9 months giving birth to this child and going through all that means, the morning sickness and everything, and you're going to treat that baby like a precious gift.
Yeah.
That life is so fragile, and you respect the gift of life. And so in a way, God is conditioning humans to respect the gift of life in doing this.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a successful gestation, birth, and first year, you're going to have a tremendous amount of appreciation for that because of how often you lose it from this point on. Yeah. Interesting.
Well, let's get to the other part.
Right, the consequence part. Again, not God ordained, just the natural outflowing of the problems that are involved with sin. And it says, "The desire shall be for your husband; he shall rule over you." And what this is saying is that there's going to be, I believe how you phrased, the battle of the sexes. There's going to be this conflict between the sexes about who's to lead and who's not to lead and who's in charge and who's not in charge. Do we see this in our society? All the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Do we see it even in marriages?
Oh, yeah.
Quite a bit.
Yep.
And what we want to definitely bring to the forefront is if, based on our sort of categorizing, this is not a curse. This is a consequence.
Yeah.
God did not look down and say, okay, now I'm going to make it so that the woman's going to want to be the head, but she's not going to be, that the man's going to be the head. Mm-hmm. That's not what's being said here. What is being said is that, like we're saying with the serpent, there's just as we look around and see there's this enmity between the animal kingdom and humanity. There's going to be this enmity between the sexes as well. That's just a natural thing that has happened as a result of this situation.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out because I think there have been far too many Christians over time who have taken that passage and used it to argue for the subordination of women, especially in the marriage relationship, but in general. To say God has now decreed that the man is going to rule over the woman, that she will be subordinate to him. And I think it is a debatable interpretation. He's not decreeing it. He's saying this is going to be the consequence of what you've done here.
Yeah, so I think we do need to be careful confusing this negative result of sin with God's design for a healthy marriage.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or a healthy church, for that matter. And people can say, well, God's the one who announced this. This is the way it should be. This must be what is best. Mm. If that logic were true, it would also be true of the previous consequence, where there will be tension between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the serpent. That these battling, the striking of the head and the heel, like that would be God's good design. Yeah. People should look for opportunities to smite snakes, and snakes should look for opportunities to bite heels. Right. But we know that's not how God wanted it to be.
Exactly.
And especially, I think, because in the vision of the kingdom that Isaiah has, I think in Isaiah 11:8, Isaiah is envisioning a time where God comes into world history and inaugurates his kingdom and makes things on earth the way he wants it to be. And it says that the wolf shall lie down with the lamb, The leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together. A child shall lead them. A cow and bear shall graze. Their young shall lie down together. The lion shall eat straw like an ox. And specifically, verse 8, the nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy at all on my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So this is a vision of wholeness and healing and restoration in creation. And specifically, you have young children playing with snakes.
Yeah.
No one getting hurt.
Right.
This is the way God wanted it to be.
Yep.
But a world where snakes hurt children and children try to crush the head of snakes, that's what sin did in the world. And if this vision of wholeness and restoration is a positive thing, then I think this has implications for the tension between men and women that we see in the consequence of sin for the woman.
Yeah. Yeah, if we're going to make an argument that it's God's intention for women to be subordinate to men, for men to rule over them, then I think what we're making an argument for is embracing a fallen order.
Yeah.
Right.
Really? That's what God has called us to do. Embrace the fallen order and just run with it and maximize its full potential. Kind of think that's not what God is imploring us to do.
Yeah, and that's really what they're saying is, well, they're misunderstanding this passage, but then they're saying, well, we're going to encourage a world in which is second best.
Yeah.
It's not the ideal.
Yeah.
Why would we do that? Why would not strive for the ideal? And I'm sure at some point we'll get back to this topic and bring in New Testament type passages. But for now, I think we're focused just on what this says and what it does not say. It does not say that that's God's intention or God's goal, but is rather a consequence of being in a world full of these sorts of things.
Yeah. And it gets to the passage we talked about a couple of weeks ago about, for Paul, in Jesus, God has reconciled all things to himself. New creation is everything.
Yeah.
We don't order our life according to the negative consequences of the fall that wreak havoc on old creation. We embrace the new creation made possible by Jesus.
Exactly.
And it seems like this tension between men and women is a fallen creation phenomenon that new creation would seek to get beyond.
Right.
Exactly. Agreed.
Yeah. Well, for the sake of time, I think we have to move forward
I think you're right.
the final passage, Sam.
Oh, I'm back up again? Am I allowed to read? Okay. And the man said, and to the man he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground. For out of it you are taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return.
All right, so we have the curse here, the thing that God changes, because we've noticed with each of these different sets of consequences, there's something that God gets in and changes, and then there's some consequences that result. Here, God seems to change nothing in the man's body himself, like he does with the woman and the serpent, but the change happens to creation.
Yeah.
Creation is cursed in such a way that it's difficult to farm. So now I want to ask the same question as I did before, and maybe I'll do a better job of answering it this time. If the punishment fits the crime, in what sense is the curse on the ground a fit divine tweaking of creation to redirect something that the man did wrong?
I got it wrong.
Go. I'm glad you do.
Sam is on it.
I am glad you do.
So, God provided them all sorts of good things to eat. Everything except one tree.
Right.
Okay? And so, but their desire was to have all of it, including this one tree. So now God's going to curse the soil so that they're not going to have it all, knocking them down a peg. Am I right, John?
Home run, Sam. Yes. Home run.
In your face.
If only I'd have done my homework.
Sam 1, Ron 0.
Yep.
Yeah, so God had given unlimited resources. I mean, all the food that they could possibly desire. and it wasn't enough. They didn't appreciate, just like the woman didn't appreciate the gift of life and was taught a lesson on how to appreciate life through painful childbearing. Just like the serpent didn't desire its status as the highest among the animals and has to become the lowest. The men who didn't appreciate all the food that God provided and just had to have even more than God provided for them, now is going to grow to appreciate the food that is put on his table every day, because it's going to take a lot of work to get it from the field, from the hard soil, into his stomach.
Yeah.
And the gift that food is will be appreciated by all humankind.
Yeah, and historically, this is something as modern Americans, Westerners, we don't appreciate, that most of human history has been characterized by famine, that people scrounge just to get enough food to keep themselves alive. And so, nowadays with modern farming, we have refrigerators and cupboards full of food. But historically, that's just not been the case. Historically, humanity has fully realized and experienced those consequences.
Yeah. And so we can think about, so what is the outcome of that? Because of the ground is cursed, the natural outcome is that there's going to be a lot of sweating. And the work is going to be hard. Mm-hmm. And if this were, again, a command, God has set it up so that man must sweat as he works the ground. Mm-hmm. And this is God's new way. His good, perfect order in a fallen world is that men must sweat and work hard. If we're going to take that literally as a mandate from God, then I think modern industrial farming equipment should be off limits for Christians.
I would think so. John Deere would be out of work, out of business.
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't that be working against God's desire that men sweat at work to build these tractors with cabs that are air conditioned, with speakers that people are listening to the after class podcast while working?
Nice.
I mean, all that would be off limits if this was a condition that, no, God wants you to sweat to work. And any attempt that you make to reverse that consequence by making it easier for men to work the soil should be off limits.
Well, and then the same would be true for easing childbirth. Women.
No epidurals.
That's right. No epidurals, no drugs. Sorry, ladies. No medical care if something goes wrong. Just sucks to be you if you have a bad birth. I mean, yeah, that's fair. We're like trying to fight back against what God has done. Shame on us as human beings.
And less tongue-in-cheek, but the Sabbath. I mean, the whole notion of the Sabbath is to give a break because we're not supposed to be these kinds of people. But God is for me, that's kind of a hint at God's goal for us. So even that goes against that very idea.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I think what we see is that in these curses, there's a curse aspect and there's a consequence part. There's a part that God says, I'm going to change things to, what did you say, take you down a peg or to remind you of your place in this world. And the things are just the nature, the consequences of what it means to live in a sinful world. Mm-hmm. And we need to be careful not to confuse the two, because when we do, it causes all sorts of issues, both in our theology, how we approach each other, and even how we live out in this fallen world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would even argue that what we put in the curse category are God's gracious initiatives. Like in putting distance between the humans and the animals, God is limiting the ability for humans and animals to cooperate together again in defiance against the Creator. In making childbirth painful, God is enabling both men and women to value the gift of life that's represented in childbearing. And by cursing the soil, God is instilling value in men and women and all people of just what a gift food is that God has given. And He's given us so much, we don't need it all. Appreciate what He's put before us each day.
I think that's a great reading. Excellent.
And then on the other hand, there are these negative consequences. Enmity between humans and animals, the battle of the sexes between men and women, and arduous labor, which is just a part of life in a fallen world that humans have to contend with. It's a part of our reality that we're dealing with. We don't have to embrace it and like it. We don't have to do nothing to make that better. If anything, we see in the prophets and the Scripture and through Torah, God is giving Israel's, like Sabbath, laws to help them overcome some of these negative consequences. God is working to overcome the negative consequences, dimensions of the fall. And the hope that we have in the kingdom, the better world to come, is when they will be fully overturned.
Yeah.
And that's the ultimate hope of the Jewish people, and I would say of the church as well.
Yeah. So a little bit of a preview as we continue. Looks like we're going to be maybe having a conversation about how God has already put this in motion, how we can begin to live out that better place in anticipation of its full consummation.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the After Class podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Done.